Harlan County, Kentucky, November 1889. The photograph arrived at the Louisville Historical Society in a leather portfolio marked only with the year and a single word: withdrawn. Inside, mounted on heavy cardstock, was a family portrait. 3 boys dressed in Sunday clothes standing before a clapboard house. Their faces were solemn, as was customary for the era. Their hands rested at their sides. The light was even, the composition unremarkable. But when the archivist tilted the frame toward the window, she saw it. Behind the 3 brothers, barely visible in the grain of the image, was the outline of a 4th figure. Not blurred, not doubled by movement or error. A 4th silhouette, distinct, proportionate, and impossibly still. The archivist would later testify that her hands went cold before her mind understood why. Check if you're already subscribed to this channel, because what you're about to hear isn't folklore. It's documented, and it's only the beginning. The photograph was taken by Samuel Greer, an itinerant portraitist who traveled the coal towns of eastern Kentucky in the 1880s. Greer was known for precision, not artistry. His images were sharp, methodical, and expensive, reserved for families who could afford to be remembered. The portrait in question was commissioned by the Tolliver family of Harlan County, 3 brothers named Jacob, Eli, and Thomas, aged 14, 12, and 9. The Tollivers were not wealthy, but they were known. Their father, Micah Tolliver, had been a Union sympathizer during the war, a dangerous position in a region still divided by old allegiances. After his death in a mine collapse in 1885, the family survived on the wages of the eldest son and the charity of distant kin. The boys were described by neighbors as quiet, industrious, and unusually close. They slept in the same room. They worked the same shifts. They rarely spoke to outsiders. The photograph was meant to be a memorial. What it became was evidence. Samuel Greer arrived in Harlan County on the morning of November 10, 1889. He set up his equipment in the yard of the Tolliver home, a single-story structure with a sagging porch and a view of the ridgeline. The session lasted less than an hour. Greer later noted in his ledger that the boys were cooperative but withdrawn. He wrote, "No smiles, no movement. They stood as though waiting for judgment." The glass plate was developed 3 days later in Louisville. Greer saw nothing unusual. The image was filed, payment was sent, and the portfolio was delivered to the family by mail. It was the mother, Sarah Tolliver, who first noticed the anomaly. She brought the photograph to the local minister, Reverend Amos Pritchard, claiming that someone, or something, had entered the frame without her knowledge. Pritchard examined the image under lamplight. He confirmed what she had seen: a 4th shape, positioned slightly behind and to the left of the youngest boy. The figure was not a trick of shadow or foliage. It was human in proportion, and it was looking at the camera. Within a week, the photograph was shown to a traveling physician, Dr. Howard Kinsley, who was visiting the county to treat an outbreak of scarlet fever. Kinsley was a man of science, trained in Philadelphia, skeptical of superstition. He studied the image with a magnifying lens and declared it optically impossible unless a 4th person was present during exposure. But Sarah Tolliver swore no one else had been in the yard that day. Not a neighbor, not a passerby, not even a dog. Dr. Kinsley made a formal request to interview the boys. What he heard would become the foundation of a case that medical journals would reference, and then suppress, for the next 30 years. Jacob, the eldest, spoke first. He described the session as ordinary, the photographer adjusting the tripod, instructing them where to stand, telling them not to blink. When asked if anyone else had been present, Jacob paused. Then he said, "Only the one who's always there." Eli, the middle brother, nodded. He added, "He doesn't talk, but he listens." Thomas, the youngest, said nothing. He stared at the floor and held his brother's hands. Dr. Kinsley pressed further. He asked the boys to describe this 4th presence. Jacob said it had been with them since their father died. Eli said it looked like them but older. Thomas finally spoke. He said, "He tells us when to be afraid." Sarah Tolliver, present during the interview, began to weep. She admitted that since Micah's death, the boys had spoken of a presence in the house, a figure they called the Elder. She had dismissed it as grief. But after the photograph, she could no longer deny what she herself had begun to sense, that her sons were not alone. Dr. Kinsley left the Tolliver home that evening deeply unsettled. In his personal journal, he wrote, "I am a man of empirical thought, but I cannot explain what I saw in that image, nor what I heard in those boys' voices. They were not lying. They were confessing." He sent the photograph to colleagues in Boston and New York. The responses were uniform, fascination followed by silence. By December, the Tolliver boys had stopped going to church. Neighbors reported seeing them standing motionless in the yard at night, shoulder to shoulder, staring toward the ridge. When spoken to, they did not respond. When approached, they walked back inside, slowly, in unison, as though guided by a single will. On the morning of December 19, 1889, Sarah Tolliver found the photograph face down on the kitchen table. Beside it was a handwritten note in her eldest son's hand. It read, "He says it's time." The boys were gone. The search began at dawn. Reverend Pritchard organized a party of 12 men, including miners, farmers, and the county constable, a man named Vance Harrell. They moved through the ridges and hollows surrounding the Tolliver property, calling the boys' names into the frozen air. The temperature that morning was 19 degrees. Snow had fallen overnight, covering the ground in a thin white crust. By mid-afternoon, the men found tracks. 3 sets of footprints, small and evenly spaced, leading uphill toward an abandoned mine shaft known locally as the Craven Hollow Dig. The mine had been closed since 1878 after a methane explosion killed 6 men. No one went there anymore. The entrance had been boarded over, marked with warnings painted in tar. But when the search party arrived, the boards had been removed. The nails lay in the snow. The entrance was open. Constable Harrell called into the darkness. There was no reply. He lit a lantern and descended, followed by 4 others. The shaft was narrow, sloping downward at a steep angle. The walls were damp. The air smelled of rot and mineral cold. 50 feet in, they found the boys. Jacob, Eli, and Thomas were sitting in a row against the far wall of a collapsed chamber. Their backs were straight. Their hands were folded in their laps. Their eyes were open. They were alive, but unresponsive. When Harold touched Jacob's shoulder, the boy did not blink. When he shouted, none of them moved. The men carried the boys out one by one. They were cold but breathing. Their pulses were slow but steady. Medically, they were intact. Psychologically, they were absent. Dr. Kinsley was summoned again. He examined each boy in the Tolliver home, testing reflexes, checking pupils, listening to their hearts. He found no physical trauma, no frostbite, no signs of starvation or dehydration, despite having been missing for nearly 20 hours in sub-freezing conditions. Their clothing was dry. Their skin was unmarked. But they would not speak. They would not eat. They would not sleep. They sat together in the same room, side by side, eyes forward, as though waiting for instruction. Sarah Tolliver begged Dr. Kinsley for answers. He had none. He prescribed rest, warmth, and time. He suggested the boys had experienced a shared delusional episode, perhaps brought on by grief and isolation. But even as he said it, he did not believe it. That night, he returned to his lodgings and reopened the photograph. He studied the shadow again, the 4th figure behind the boys. And for the first time, he noticed something he had missed before. The figure's face, though blurred, bore a resemblance to the boys, not identical, but familial. As though it were a composite of all 3, or a projection of what they might become. Dr. Kinsley wrote to a colleague in Boston, Dr. Emil Voss, a neurologist with an interest in psychological phenomena. He enclosed the photograph and a summary of the case. Voss replied within 2 weeks. His letter was cautious but intrigued. He wrote, "If what you describe is accurate, then we are witnessing either collective hysteria of unprecedented coordination or something far more troubling, a shared consciousness induced by trauma. I would like to observe the boys personally. Dr. Voss arrived in Harlan County in late January 1890. By then, the boys had not spoken in 6 weeks. They had lost weight but remained otherwise stable. They moved only when led. They ate only when food was placed in their mouths. Their eyes tracked movement but never focused on faces. Voss conducted a series of tests. He spoke to them individually and collectively. He introduced stimuli, images, sounds, objects from their past. Nothing elicited a response. He measured their breathing, heart rate, and body temperature simultaneously and found something extraordinary. Their physiological rhythms were synchronized. When one boy's heart rate increased, so did the others, at the exact same moment. When one exhaled, the others followed in perfect unison. Voss repeated the tests over 3 days. The synchronization never wavered. He concluded that the boys had entered what he called a state of relational paralysis, a condition in which individual identity had been subsumed by collective identity. He theorized that the trauma of their father's death had fractured their sense of self, and that they had unconsciously merged into a single psychological entity to survive. But that theory could not explain the photograph, it could not explain the mine, and it could not explain what happened next. On February 4th, 1890, the boys stood up, all three at the same time without prompting. They walked to the front door of the house, opened it, and stepped outside into the snow. Sarah Tolliver screamed for help. Neighbors came running. They found the boys standing in the yard, facing the ridge, exactly where they had stood for the photograph. And they were smiling, not the natural smiles of children, but identical measured expressions, as though they had been told to smile and were obeying. Reverend Pritchard approached them slowly. He asked if they were all right. Jacob turned his head, slowly, mechanically, and said, "We're ready now." Then all 3 boys turned and walked back into the house. They sat down in their chairs, and they resumed their silence. Dr. Voss witnessed the event. He recorded it in his notes with trembling handwriting. He wrote, "They are not individuals. They are iterations of a single will, and that will is not their own." By the spring of 1890, the case of the Tolliver boys had begun to circulate in academic and medical circles. Dr. Voss published a brief, anonymized account in the Journal of Nervous and Mental Disease, describing the synchronization of physiological responses and the hypothesis of collective dissociation. He omitted mention of the photograph and the mine. The response was mixed. Some colleagues found the case fascinating, others dismissed it as poorly documented hysteria. But in Harlan County, the boys were no longer a curiosity. They were a warning. Neighbors avoided the Tolliver home. Children were forbidden from playing near the property. Rumors spread that the boys had been touched by something in the mine, something old, something patient, something that had been waiting. Sarah Tolliver tried to maintain normalcy. She cooked for her sons. She read to them from the Bible. She prayed aloud in their presence, hoping that faith might break whatever held them. But the boys remained unreachable. They sat. They breathed. They waited. On April 12, 1890, a new photograph was taken. Dr. Voss, seeking documentation of the boys' condition, hired a local photographer to capture their current state. The session took place in the same yard, under similar light. The boys were positioned as they had been in the original portrait, standing in a row, hands at their sides, eyes forward. The photographer developed the plate that evening. When Dr. Voss examined the image, he felt his chest tighten. The 4th figure was clearer now, not a shadow, not a blur. A fully formed silhouette, standing directly behind Thomas, the youngest. Its proportions were unmistakable, its posture was identical to the boys. And its face, though still indistinct, was turning toward the camera. Dr. Voss showed the photograph to Sarah Tolliver. She stared at it for a long time, then whispered, "That's Micah." Voss asked her to explain. She said the figure resembled her late husband, not in feature but in presence, the way he had stood, the way he had watched over the boys when they were small. She said she had felt him in the house since his death, but she had believed it was memory. Now she knew it was something else. Dr. Voss did not believe in ghosts, but he could not explain the image. He sent the photograph to colleagues in Europe, to Vienna, to Paris, to Edinburgh. The responses were uniform: disbelief followed by silence. One letter, however, stood out. It came from Dr. Heinrich Müller, a German physician researching folie à famille, a proposed condition in which entire families share delusions or psychological symptoms. Müller wrote, "If this is genuine, you are not documenting illness. You are documenting evolution." Müller believed that extreme trauma could trigger latent capacities in the human mind, capacities for connection, synchronization, and shared perception that modern science had not yet mapped. He theorized that the Tolliver boys had not fragmented. They had fused, and that fusion had created something new. He requested permission to visit. Dr. Voss agreed. Müller arrived in Harlan County in late May 1890. He was a tall, thin man with silver hair and a clinical demeanor. He examined the boys extensively, taking notes in German script, measuring cranial dimensions, testing reflexes, observing sleep patterns. He confirmed Voss's findings. The boys were physiologically synchronized. But Müller went further. He theorized that the boys were accessing what he called das Gemeinschaftsbewusstsein, a collective unconscious that existed not within individual minds, but between them. He believed that trauma had dissolved the boundaries of selfhood, allowing the boys to perceive reality through a shared lens. And that lens, Müller suggested, might be seeing something the rest of them could not. On the evening of June 3, 1890, Müller conducted an experiment. He placed the boys in separate rooms, Jacob in the kitchen, Eli in the parlor, Thomas in the bedroom. He closed the doors. He stood in the hallway and clapped his hands once. Then he opened each door in sequence. All three boys had turned to face the same direction, toward the hallway, toward the sound, at the exact same moment. Müller repeated the experiment with different stimuli: a bell, a whisper, a knock. Each time the boys responded in perfect unison, despite being isolated from one another. Müller concluded that they were not merely synchronized. They were perceiving through a single awareness distributed across three bodies. He wrote in his journal, "We are witnessing a new form of human existence. They are no longer brothers. They are one entity expressed in triplicate." But Dr. Voss was troubled. He asked Müller a question that had been growing in his mind since the first photograph. "If they are one, then who is the fourth?" Müller did not answer. But that night, he requested to see the photographs again. He studied them under lamplight, comparing the original portrait to the second image, and he saw what Voss had not yet articulated. The fourth figure was growing more defined over time. It was not fading. It was emerging. Müller met with Sarah Tolliver the following morning. He asked her to describe her husband's final days. She said Micah had been acting strangely before the mine collapse. He had stopped sleeping. He spoke to himself in the dark. He told her he felt like he was being watched, not by God, but by something smaller and closer, something inside him. She said he died in the mine on a Tuesday. The boys changed the following Sunday. Müller asked if the boys had been present when their father's body was recovered. Sarah said they had. They had stood together at the mine head, silent and still, as the men brought Micah up, and when they saw his face, they did not cry, they only stared. Müller wrote, "The father is not dead, he is distributed." He believed that Micah Tolliver's consciousness, perhaps fractured by trauma or prolonged isolation underground, had imprinted itself onto his sons at the moment of his death. And that imprint was not memory. It was presence. The boys were not haunted. They were inhabited. On June 10th, 1890, the boys spoke again. All three at once in unison, in a voice that was neither theirs nor their father's, but something woven between them. They said, "We see now." Dr. Voss asked what they saw. The boys turned to face him, their expressions blank, their eyes unblinking. They said, "Everything you've hidden." Then they stood and walked to the door. Sarah Tolliver tried to stop them. They did not resist. They simply waited until she stepped aside. Then they walked out into the yard, into the fading light, and stood exactly where they had stood for both photographs. And they raised their hands, palms forward, fingers spread, as though reaching for something invisible. Dr. Muller photographed them. The image would never be published. It showed the boys in the yard, hands raised, faces tilted upward, and behind them, clearly visible now, was the fourth figure, no longer a shadow, no longer a blur. It was a man, tall, lean, familiar. And it was holding them. If you've read this far, leave a comment with the words, "I see the fourth." Let me know you're still watching, because what comes next will test everything you think you understand about consciousness, identity, and where the self truly ends. Summer arrived in Harlan County with heat and dust, but the Tolliver home remained cold. Neighbors reported seeing lights in the windows late at night, not candles or lanterns, but something dimmer, bluer, like phosphorescence. Some claimed to hear voices, though no one could say whose. The boys were rarely seen outside. When they were, they moved together in lockstep, never straying more than an arm's length from one another. Dr. Voss and Dr. Muller remained in the county, lodging at a boarding house near the town center. They continued their observations, visiting the Tolliver home twice weekly. Each visit confirmed the same unsettling truth. The boys were stable, healthy, and utterly transformed. They spoke only in unison. They moved as one, and they claimed to perceive things that no one else could see. On July 2, 1890, the boys made a request. They asked to return to the mine. Sarah Tolliver refused. Dr. Voss advised against it. But Dr. Muller, driven by a need to understand, suggested that denying the boys might cause more harm than allowing them. He believed they were drawn to the mine not by compulsion, but by clarity, that something in that darkness had answered a question they did not yet know how to ask. After days of debate, Sarah reluctantly agreed. On the morning of July 8th, a small party was assembled. The two doctors, Constable Harrell, Reverend Pritchard, and Sarah herself. The boys led the way. They walked without hesitation through the forest, up the ridge, toward the Craven Hollow mine shaft. Their pace was steady. Their breathing synchronized. They did not speak. When they reached the entrance, they stopped and turned to the adults. Jacob said, in that shared voice, "Only we can go in." Dr. Muller protested. He insisted on accompanying them, for observation and safety. But the boys shook their heads in unison. Eli said, "He won't let you." Voss asked who he was. Thomas answered flatly, "Father." Sarah Tolliver gasped. She begged the boys not to go inside. But they had already turned toward the entrance. They descended into the dark, single file, without lanterns, without fear. The adults waited at the mouth of the shaft. Minutes passed in silence. Then an hour. Then 2. The sun climbed higher. The air grew hot. Still, there was no sound from below. Constable Harrell finally broke. He took a lantern and started down. Dr. Muller followed. They moved carefully, calling out as they went. The shaft was cold and narrow, the walls slick with moisture. At the 50-foot mark, they found the chamber where the boys had been discovered months earlier. But this time the boys were not sitting. They were standing in a circle, facing inward, holding hands. Their eyes were closed, their lips were moving, but no sound emerged. Muller approached slowly. He whispered their names. None responded. He touched Jacob's shoulder. The boy's skin was ice cold. Then, all 3 boys opened their eyes at once, and they smiled. Not the mechanical smiles from before. These were different, genuine, even joyful, as though they had finally understood something that had eluded them all their lives. Jacob spoke. "We met him." Eli added, "He's not dead." Thomas finished. "He's waiting." Muller asked what they meant. The boys released each other's hands and turned to face him. Their expressions were calm, serene, and they spoke in a voice that was no longer theirs alone. "We are 4 now. We have always been 4. You just couldn't see." Constable Harrell stepped back. Dr. Muller stood frozen. The boys walked past them, out of the chamber, up the shaft, and into the daylight. When they emerged, they were different again, not in appearance, but in presence. They stood together in the yard, looked at their mother, and said, "He wants you to know he's proud." Sarah Tolliver collapsed. Reverend Pritchard caught her. The boys did not move to help. They simply waited, patient and still, as though time meant nothing to them anymore. That night, Dr. Miller wrote a letter to a colleague in Vienna, Dr. Franz Hartmann, a psychologist studying altered states of consciousness. In the letter, Muller described the boy's transformation and posed a question that had been haunting him. What if the self is not singular? What if consciousness can exist not in one body, but across many, distributed, shared, synchronous? And if so, what becomes of individuality? What becomes of death? Hartmann replied 3 weeks later. His response was brief but chilling. If what you describe is true, then you are not studying illness. You are studying transcendence. And transcendence, historically, has always come at a cost. By August, the boys had stopped eating regularly. They drank water but showed little interest in food. Their bodies did not weaken, but their connection to the physical world seemed to thin. They spent hours sitting in the yard, motionless, eyes open, as though listening to something the rest of the world could not hear. Dr. Voss grew concerned. He performed medical examinations and found no signs of malnutrition or organ failure. The boys' vitals remained steady. But something was changing. Their speech had become slower, more deliberate, as though translating thoughts from another language. On August 15th, the boys made another request. They asked for the photograph, the original portrait from November 1889. Sarah retrieved it from a drawer where she had hidden it, unable to look at it anymore. She gave it to the boys. They held it together, each touching a corner, and stared at the image for a long time. Then Jacob said, "This is when it started." Eli said, "This is when we became whole." Thomas said, "This is when he came through." Dr. Miller asked them to explain. The boys turned the photograph around so the adults could see. They pointed to the fourth figure, the shadow that had become a silhouette, the silhouette that had become a man. And they said, in perfect unison, "He's not in the picture. He's in us." Dr. Voss felt the floor tilt beneath him. He asked the boys if they believed their father was possessing them. They shook their heads. Jacob said, "Possession is force. This is union." Eli said, "He didn't take us. We let him in." Thomas said, "And now we can't tell where he ends and we begin." Sarah Tolliver wept. She asked if her sons were still themselves. The boys looked at her with something that resembled pity. They said, "We are what we were always meant to be." That evening, Dr. Miller and Dr. Voss sat together in the parlor of the boarding house. Miller was agitated. He believed they had witnessed something unprecedented, evidence of consciousness operating beyond the limits of individual bodies. He wanted to publish the findings, to document the case, to present it to the scientific community. But Dr. Voss was afraid. He said the case was too unstable, too controversial, too easy to dismiss as fraud or delusion. He said publishing would ruin their reputations and endanger the boys. Miller argued that silence was a greater betrayal. He said if they did not document this, no one would believe it had ever happened. He said the boys deserved to be understood, not hidden. But Voss was resolute. He said the world was not ready, and neither were they. They agreed to continue observations privately, they agreed to protect the boys, and they agreed never to show the photographs to anyone outside their circle. It was the last agreement they would keep. On September 1st, 1890, the boys stopped speaking, not because they couldn't, but because they no longer needed to. They communicated through glances, gestures, and synchronous movement. When one wanted water, all three stood and walked to the well. When one was tired, all three lay down. Their thoughts, it seemed, had become entirely transparent to one another. Dr. Miller conducted one final test. He separated the boys again, this time placing them in different buildings across town. He asked each independently to draw a picture of home. All three drew the same image: the mine shaft, the entrance, the dark. and in the center of each drawing, barely visible, was a fourth figure, watching. Autumn came to Harlan County with frost and silence. The Tolliver boys no longer attended church. They no longer left the property. Neighbors whispered that the house felt wrong, that passing it made their skin crawl, that dogs refused to walk near it, that birds no longer sang in the trees above. Sarah Tolliver aged 10 years in 10 months. Her hair turned gray. Her voice grew hoarse from prayers that went unanswered. She loved her sons, but she could no longer recognize them. They were polite. They were obedient. But they were no longer hers. Dr. Voss visited less frequently. He had begun to doubt his own observations. He wondered if he had projected meaning onto coincidence, if he had allowed grief and mystery to cloud his judgment. He wrote in his journal, "Science requires repeatability, but what we have witnessed cannot be repeated. It can only be endured." Dr. Muller, however, remained committed. He had begun corresponding with occultists and spiritualists across Europe, seeking alternative frameworks for what the boys had become. He no longer believed the case could be explained through neurology or psychology alone. He believed the boys had crossed a threshold, that they existed now in a liminal state between individual identity and collective consciousness. He called it Die Schwelle, the threshold. On October 10, 1890, Dr. Muller returned to the Tolliver home with a proposal. He wanted to conduct one final experiment, a photographic session in the mine itself, at the exact location where the boys had experienced their transformation. Sarah Tolliver refused. She said the mine had already taken too much. But Muller argued that documentation was essential, that without evidence, the case would be dismissed as fantasy. He promised the boys would not be harmed. He promised it would be brief. Reluctantly, Sarah agreed. The session was scheduled for October 14th at midday. Dr. Muller hired a photographer from Lexington, a man named Orrin Blackwell, known for his work in difficult conditions. Blackwell brought portable lamps, magnesium flares, and a collapsible tripod designed for confined spaces. The party descended into the mine: Muller, Blackwell, Constable Harrell, and the three boys. Sarah remained above, praying at the entrance. The shaft was colder than before, the air thicker. The boys moved without hesitation, leading the way to the chamber. When they arrived, Blackwell set up his equipment. The boys stood in their familiar formation, shoulder to shoulder, hands at their sides, eyes forward. Muller instructed them to remain still. He told Blackwell to take 3 exposures. The first plate was developed on-site using a portable darkroom tent. When Blackwell examined the image, he went pale. He showed it to Muller without a word. The photograph showed the 3 boys clearly, but behind them, filling the frame, were dozens of figures, indistinct, overlapping, translucent. Not ghosts, not shadows, impressions, as though the walls of the chamber were saturated with the residue of human presence. Muller asked Blackwell if it was a chemical error. Blackwell shook his head. He said the plate was clean, the image was accurate. Muller took the second exposure himself. This time he asked the boys to close their eyes. They obeyed. The flash illuminated the chamber. When the plate was developed, the result was identical, except the figures behind the boys were now turned toward the camera. Constable Harrell demanded they leave. He said the mine was cursed. But Muller insisted on one final exposure. He wanted the boys to open their eyes and speak, to see if the figures would respond. The boys agreed. Blackwell prepared the third plate. Muller counted down. At the moment of exposure, the boys opened their eyes and said in unison, "We are not alone. We have never been alone." The flash erupted. The chamber went silent. And then, from somewhere deep in the shaft, came the sound of footsteps. Slow, measured, approaching. Constable Harrell drew his revolver. Dr. Muller stood frozen. The boys remained calm. They turned toward the sound and said, "He's here." The footsteps stopped. The air grew colder. And then, at the edge of the lamplight, a figure emerged. Tall, lean, familiar. It was Micah Tolliver, or something wearing his shape. The figure did not speak. It did not move. It simply stood there, at the threshold of darkness, looking at the boys, and the boys looked back. Mueller whispered, "Is it real?" The boys answered, "It's as real as we are." Then the figure stepped forward and vanished, not into shadow, not into smoke. It simply ceased to be visible, as though it had passed through a membrane separating presence from perception. The boys smiled. They said, "Now you see." Blackwell collapsed. Harold dragged him toward the exit. Miller grabbed the photographic plates and followed. The boys walked calmly behind them, as though nothing extraordinary had occurred. When they emerged into daylight, Sarah Tolliver screamed. The boys looked different. Not in feature, but in essence. Their eyes were clearer, their postures straighter. They looked older, not physically but spiritually, as though decades of experience had been compressed into moments. They walked to their mother, embraced her, and said, "We're still here, but we're not just us anymore." Dr. Mueller developed the third plate that night. When he saw the image, he wept. The photograph showed the boys with their eyes open, mouths forming words, and behind them, in perfect clarity, stood Micah Tolliver, his hand on Thomas's shoulder, his gaze directed at the camera. But that was not what broke Miller. What broke him was the realization that Micah was smiling, and so were the boys. The photographs were sealed in a leather case and delivered to the Louisville Historical Society in November 1890. Dr. Mueller included a letter explaining the context, the observations, and his conclusions. He wrote, "What we have documented is not madness. It is not fraud. It is evidence of a phenomenon that science has not yet named, the survival of consciousness beyond the dissolution of the body and its capacity to merge with the living. The Tolliver boys are not possessed. They are expanded, and their father has not died. He has become distributed." The society acknowledged receipt of the materials. They were filed under unverified phenomena and never displayed publicly. Dr. Voss returned to Boston and never spoke of the case again. He died in 1902 of a stroke, leaving behind journals that his family burned without reading. Dr. Mueller returned to Germany and spent the remainder of his life studying consciousness, memory, and identity. He published several papers on collective perception, but never mentioned the Tolliver boys by name. He died in 1911, still believing the case was the most important of his career. Constable Harrell resigned 2 weeks after the mine session. He moved west and never returned to Kentucky. He told friends he could no longer sleep without seeing figures at the foot of his bed. Orrin Blackwell, the photographer, destroyed his remaining plates and refused all future work involving portraiture. He said he could no longer trust his own eyes. And the Tolliver boys? They lived. For the next 7 years, they remained in Harlan County, inseparable and inscrutable. They worked odd jobs. They kept to themselves. They never married. They never left Kentucky. And they never stopped moving in unison. Neighbors said they could still see it, the fourth figure standing just behind them in the evening light. Some said it was their father. Others said it was something older, something the mine had held long before the Tollivers arrived. On March 3, 1897, the boys disappeared. Sarah Tolliver woke to find their beds empty, the front door open, and a single photograph on the kitchen table, the original portrait from 1889. On the back, in handwriting that belonged to all 3 boys and none of them, was written, "We are going deeper. There is more to see." A search was organized. The mine was explored again. No bodies were found. No traces. No evidence of departure. It was as though they had stepped out of the world entirely. Some believe they returned to the mine and never emerged. Others believe they walked into the forest and became something else. A few claim to have seen them years later, standing at the edge of town at dusk, 3 figures moving as one, watching the road, waiting for someone. The photographs remain in the archives of the Louisville Historical Society. Researchers have examined them. Scientists have tested them. No one has been able to explain the fourth figure. No one has been able to explain the synchronization. And no one has been able to explain why, in every image, the figure behind the boys seems to be looking not at the camera, but through it, at the viewer, at you. If you've watched this far, it's because you liked this story. Leave a comment saying, "I've watched this far," so I can get to know you and see who really enjoys the stories here on the channel. And if you believe some mysteries should never be forgotten, if you believe the past is still watching, then subscribe. Share this story. Let others see what was buried, because history doesn't end. It just waits for us to look closely enough. And when we do, it looks back.